welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Amy Lynn is a writer and educator who lives in Calgary, Canada. She's a graduate of the MFA program at Warren Wilson College. Her short fiction has been published in Plowshares, and she's been awarded residencies from Yaddo and Casa Kamala. The memoir, Hereafter, is her first book. Amy Lynn, thank you so much for joining to talk about your debut memoir, Hereafter. In a starred review, Kirkus Review calls Hereafter a beautifully visceral and emotionally intimate depiction of young widowhood. In another starred review, Booklist says it's heartbreaking, beautiful, and above all, honest. In yet another starred review, Library Journal says Lynn's memoir dazzles. Each chapter breathes with urgency, written in poetic, fragmented chapters that convey how deeply people want to find words for what's wordless, to discover meaning in the meaningless. And author Lauren Groff says, it's been years since I've been so rocked, so moved by any book as I have been by Hereafter by the earthquaking new talent, Amy Lynn. What a great gift she has given us. So, Amy, what can you tell us about this gift that you've given your memoir, Hereafter?
I mean, truly the gift is those readers' connection to it. Lauren and the reviewers from Kirkus Booklist and Library Journal. And that feels, even hearing you read that feels like a gift to me, really. Sorry, I've completely forgotten. This is part of grief. I've forgotten what you said to me. What did you say?
I said, what can you tell us? What can you tell us about Hereafter?
Oh, amazing. Hereafter is a memoir about my experience of grief, which continues, but particularly my experience of grief in the early years after my husband, Curtis Nishiyama, died very suddenly in August of 2020. It first began not as a book, but as a Substack called At the Bottom of Everything that I still write, although slightly less intensely. I wrote every single week for almost 2 years, actually, in the beginning.
Wow.
And I did that at the behest of my therapist, who really believed and continues to believe that people do not survive rifts in time and in their lives like this without allowing other people to know how they feel. And I'm very private in a lot of ways. And so the Substack felt like the best way to tell people how I was feeling. And after the first 2 years, my agent actually asked if I thought it was a book. And that was when I started thinking about what is now Hereafter.
You say that Hereafter is for people who keep pressing a bruise, even when it hurts. What does that mean?
It means that it is for people who understand that something hurts and then almost inexplicably have to go towards that, whether they're driven towards it or whether they have to go towards it or whether they are in some way drawn to it. And I think I've always said that Hereafter is not a book about pain, it's a book in pain.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, and I think that people who tend to bruise easily are often in pain. But also when they push on the bruise, they know it's going to cause pain, but it's almost as if they have to prove to themselves just how much they're going to be in. And when I was grieving very acutely, though you are in acute grief for the first 5 years, but especially in those first 2 years,
Yeah.
my therapist kind of said, you have to go towards the pain sometimes. You actually have to inhabit it, because if you don't start living in it, if you don't start tending to it, if you don't start processing it, it's going to ossify or it's going to solidify. And then you won't be able to go towards it. It will have gotten integrated and you're going to carry that weight around your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually had to be someone who pushed on, this arterial bleed in my body, this pain, because it is ultimately a path towards living again, if that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. You've also said that for you, writing about grief isn't cathartic as some people might have suggested,
Yeah.
but it's necessary for survival.
Yeah. I get asked a lot if writing is cathartic, which
Mm-hmm.
I think comes from this very human desire where we don't want people to stay in pain.
Yeah.
Mostly people with of course your notable exceptions,
Mm-hmm.
want to alleviate the average person from pain. We want to make people feel better if we see them, crying or are in pain. So when people ask me if writing is cathartic, I know that it's coming from this really human, really kind place of please tell me that you're not in as much pain as you were.
Mm-hmm.
But the difficult thing is that catharsis is this idea of release, that you're
Mm-hmm.
releasing something. And I am releasing a book, but not the pain that lives in the book and not the pain that motivated the book, but the writing, while not cathartic,
Mm-hmm.
is an instrument that I have at my disposal for being able to live with pain. And so I often say to people, well, if you're drowning and you get tossed a life ring, nobody grasps the life ring when they're drowning and thinks, oh my God, catharsis, I found it at last. They think, oh my God, finally, I have something to hang on to. So there is a kind of relief. And I think in writing, while it's not catharsis, there is a kind of relief in being able to invite people into and allow people to witness the pain that you're in. And this is what I'm always saying about grief is that while it's well-intentioned, the attempt to remove people's pain is misguided.
Mm-hmm.
The best thing that we can do for people who are grieving is to witness it, to literally allow them to express what they're like and to give them space for that.
Mm-hmm.
And hereafter, I hope, is that place that people can meet with their own pain, but that also people who are supporting people who are in pain can come to it and find a place to understand some of the interiority of their beloved's pain.
Yeah, and you talk about that. I feel like in the book, your feeling of not wanting to tire out the people that were trying to support you, and how this
Yeah.
often happens with people who are grieving, feeling like you need to hide your own grief just in order to be able to keep friends close around you, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunately a really well-known statistic that most grievers will lose over half of their support base in the first year of grieving
Wow.
because the realities, the endurance of grief, which is chronic, it doesn't go away. It
Hmm.
kind of changes its form, but it is it exists once it is present in your life. It really exhausts people that are not in grief themselves, and people just kind of can't handle it anymore. And so for a lot of grievers, they're really afraid of expressing how they feel, especially when you reach year two, which is often much harder than year one for grievers, partially because of the sense that they should be back to their lives, but they're not. The second year of grieving for me was really awful in
Hmm.
its own ways. And I had a lot of support. I was sort of an outlier in that sense, because I was really grateful to have support. But I had other friends who I think got around 8 months and it was kind of like, okay, it's just me. And it makes you afraid of sharing your pain. And that's really isolating and it's really heavy because it hasn't changed.
Hmm.
And so the gift then becomes the people that meet you in that place and say, it's actually okay. You can tell me how it feels.
And you learned through this that you're talking about, the 2-year mark and then 5 years. And you learned that these 5 stages of grief that we've all sort of heard about
Yeah, they're
and
everywhere.
apply to, yeah, are not what we think they are, right?
No, I mean, first of all, they're not actually intended for people who are suffering, bereavement. They were part of a study that looked at how people were processing their own death because they were people with fatal illness. So that is it's its own kind of grief, but it is a different kind of reckoning with mortality.
Mhm.
And so the 5 stages arose out of that. This was this idea of how someone diagnosed with something terminal would start to process the realities of their impending death.
Mhm.
Somewhere along the way, these stages got applied to anybody experiencing a death, which is anytime we take something that was very specific to one specific thing and then blow it up and apply it to a massive whole, we know that we're erasing the realities of specific experiences.
Yeah.
So it was really crazy for me to learn that the 5 stages were not intended for the kinds of grief that I was experiencing that lots of people do. And I was lucky because where I live in Canada, we're the only city in Canada that provides provincially funded, so accessible, as in you do not have to pay personally,
Wow.
grief therapy for people who are experiencing immediate family member loss. It's through the Bob Glasgow Grief Center. And if you experience an immediate family member who dies, you call a number and they take your information. And it's a trust system that they're not, give us the death certificate. They just say,
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about your story. And you receive 16 individual sessions with a grief counselor who specializes in grief therapy, and then 2 months of group therapy. And it was through all of this that I was taught about grief outside of the 5 stages.
Mhm.
These were the people that said to me, the 5 stages are well intended, but they don't apply to you. This isn't how you're going to experience grief. And I feel really lucky because I entered that program 2 months after Curtis died.
Wow.
Even though I was in a haze, I still had someone weekly for, 4 months telling me, this is normal. The stages don't apply to you. Oh, you can't remember a single thing? Guess what? You're probably going to be like that for 5, 10, maybe your whole life because your brain has experienced physical trauma. Grief is not just emotional, it's physical as well. And I was so grateful for that. And it remains really shocking to me that we don't all have access to that. And
Yeah.
it's brutal because so many people feel literally insane because their brains, I've gone on a tangent here, so forgive me, but
That's great.
in grief, the prefrontal cortex, so this part of our brain here, which
Mhm.
does communication, memory, emotional regulation, things like personal hygiene, the blood, as soon as you enter grief, is literally drawn away from these parts of the brain and sent to the back parts of the brain, which controls survival. And
Wow.
so if you're trying to literally remember a doctor's appointment or your mother's birthday or how to shower, you are actually working with less blood to that part of the brain. It is physically harder for you to do those things in grief. And that lasts at least 5 years. And I didn't understand that until I was in this program.
No, I'm sitting here right now thinking, why doesn't everyone know that?
Yeah,
Why isn't that
that's
common knowledge?
yeah, exactly. And the answer to that is because we don't talk about grief. People
Mm.
are so busy trying to make us feel better, which is a really kind human instinct.
Mhm.
But really, nobody, unless you're trained in it, is saying it's totally normal that you can't remember anything. Like I still, even 3.5 years later, I just did it earlier. You asked me a question. I
Mhm.
made the mistake of going on a small tangent and I couldn't remember what you said.
Mhm.
Before Curtis died, I have like a almost photogenic memory. I don't technically have a photogenic
Mhm.
memory, but a crazy memory.
Wow.
And it the day Curtis died, it was gone. I still have to write things down. I have to constantly ask people to repeat things, or I'll say, I'm so sorry. I know
Mhm.
you just told me this, but I can't remember it. That's grief. That's brain trauma. And lots of people don't know that. They think they've lost their minds. They think, how can I not remember a simple time? Well, the answer is you literally don't have, you have a brain injury.
What a gift for people to be able to recognize that
Yes.
and know that as well, and to actually think of it as a brain injury.
Yeah. Well, we know from studies that emotional pain is processed in the brain as physical pain. Yeah. So I was really grateful because I got all of that front loaded by this grief program, but so many people don't have access to that. And a part of the book where I speak a little bit about that is trying to crack that door open for people, for them to realize what's happening to you is awful and your life is shattered. But also, there's a physical reason for why you can't recall people's names 4 seconds after they tell you.
Mhm.
And it's going to be that way for a long time. And lots of people in grief really struggle to return to work because they can't track details. And after the year, people are like, what do you mean you can't go
Yeah.
back to work? What do you mean you keep forgetting stuff? And because we understand so little about grief, I think people think that grievers are kind of like trumping it up. They're really not.
Mhm.
They have a physical reason behind those things.
It's so important to know. Uh, when you started, so you went into therapy and you said, um, it was your therapist who recommended that you start writing
Yeah.
about your grief and writing your Substack. How far in was that? At what point did you actually sit down and start
So I
writing?
started writing exactly 1 month after Curtis died,
Wow.
which is unhinged because I had just gotten out of the hospital myself after almost dying myself. And I look back now and I think, I can't believe I wrote every week from a month after Curtis died for 2 years. But the thing about, I was like physically unable at that time. I couldn't walk without a walker. I felt emotionally totally incapable.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, not
Yeah.
to throw you off in the, but
Yeah.
yes, it was you not only lost your beloved, you then just a few days,
10 days. Yeah.
after that, you were diagnosed with your
Yeah.
own.
With blood clots. So I had deep vein thrombosis with this, which is like blood clots in your veins, but I also had
Mhm.
pulmonary embolism, which is blood clots in your lungs. And I had them to such a degree that it was life-threatening, and I had a whole bunch of procedures, and it was very serious. And I was, when someone dies really suddenly, I was in clinical shock for months and I did not really realize it. So a lot of this like kind of washed over me. I'm nodding as the physician. I'm saying, you're going to get admitted to hospital immediately. And I'm like turning to look at my dad and saying, like, is he telling me I'm gonna die? And my dad is like, we're gonna get you on medication. And I look back and I think about how intense that experience was for my parents who just lost their son-in-law and then their kid who's in a lot of pain and kind of like not even really processing fully what's going on. They're having to field questions like, am I dying? And that's really intense, and so it wasn't just intense for me. I was in so much shock that in some ways I think the intensity really resided with my family members who were like, wait, are we planning 2 funerals now?
Oh,
Um, and so it all happened in this kind of intense pressure cooker of COVID. That's the other thing,
mhm.
is we were in the middle of, COVID starting to crest and lockdowns. And yeah, it was just, there was so much that I had no control over, a global pandemic, how my parents were processing everything that was going on, a total inability to process what I was doing. So reaching for writing
Mhm.
was the only thing I felt like I could do. So while it's crazy to say I started a month after Curtis died,
Mhm.
it was the only thing I could do, literally the only thing I could do.
And do you sit down at your computer? Do you write out by hand? What was
No,
that?
I write on a laptop.
Mhm.
So I wrote really on the couch for 2 years because I had such mobility. I had to work back to full mobility after my procedures. So most of the time I wrote in a sweatsuit, sitting on my parents' couch with my laptop, which is still how I write. Um, I'm starting to maybe consider that this kind of like hunchback approach that I have to writing is maybe not great for my neck and shoulders, but it is how I've always written.
I know what you mean about the hunchback approach.
Yeah, it's
Um,
hard to get away from it.
yes, it is. Yeah. Um, So you're writing. Did you know right away from that first the month after when you open your laptop, did you think at that point it was going to be this was maybe going to be just for you, or did you know at that point I'm getting this out there, I'm
You know,
starting
I
this?
really, I really thought it was going to be for me.
Mhm.
I don't think about publishing books, truthfully.
Mm.
Um, I think if you think about publishing books, the chance of you writing one is very slow, truthfully,
Mm,
because it's
mhm,
overwhelming.
mhm,
Um, yeah, I made the letters public because I wanted to allow people to opt in or opt out. I think in grief, we can and we should ask people for help, but that we don't have to expect it. We have to allow
mm,
people their agency, you know?
mhm,
And so I wanted to ask people, please witness my journey. Please hear the pain that I'm in. But I didn't want to leverage my relationship with them. Like, if you love me, you'll do this, or make them feel pressured. Please, please, please do it. You know, I
mhm,
wanted them to choose because everybody has difficult things in their lives. And I was certainly in the middle of a global pandemic, not under any illusions that I was the person in the most pain in the world.
mm,
I wanted people to choose. And I really felt like it would be my mom and me. I really, my mom would subscribe and my grandma, who both of whom did
oh,
and still do.
mm,
And I thought that would kind of be the extent of it. And I was just really moved and continue to be really moved by the people, strangers, a lot of them, who continue to write me and read me and support me. And that's been something beautiful. And I think that's something that my therapist kind of intuited that I
mhm.
couldn't have known about. And that's the beauty. That's the true beauty of people who support people who are grieving. Witness is really sustaining.
When did you know that you were you wanted to publish this as a memoir?
Well, partially when my agent asked me, and I, without having a book manuscript, said, yeah, I think I have a memoir manuscript. She was like, great, when would that be coming on my desk?
Mm,
Um, Kind of after she prompted me to think about it, I thought, okay, I should think about this. And
mm,
I took all of the Substack letters and I put them all into one big Word document. And I had, I think at that point, 2 years of letters, which was about 110,000 words. And I thought, wow, this is a good length, you know? But the issue was when I looked at it, I didn't have a book. I just had 110,000 words. And at that point, I thought, okay, maybe I just have a really personal project, but I don't have a book. And there is a difference, certainly for me.
mhm,
But I started just playing around, like what might make this feel like a project. And the book, as you know, I'm sure you know, is written in these very small, very condensed paragraphs. And those came about because one day, I think it had been about 4 months in of tinkering with this document. I was just about ready to say to my agent, I don't have a book. I have a project, and that's okay. You know, not
mm,
everything needs to be a book.
mhm,
But to see, I reached a point where I wanted to see in the sea of the words that I had what I really had to say. And so I made a text box in Word, which is this really archaic thing where you cue Word to make literally a box and it forms on the page and you can drag text into it, but it can only hold a certain amount. And I made one for every page of this extraordinarily long Word document. And for every page, I would dump the page's words into it and I would keep deleting sentences until I came to something I thought, no, that's exactly something I want to say about grief. But I would only allow myself to keep this much of the page. And so by kind of narrowing away the words that I needed to say at the time, but didn't need to keep,
mhm,
I began to see the sort of bright bone of grief, the really essential parts of my pain.
mhm.
And it was about a month into this, it took a long time to do this,
Yeah.
into this kind of cutting away that I messaged my agent and I said, okay, I have a book. But it wasn't until I could see exactly what I wanted to say about pain that I said, oh, okay, this is now a book, not a project.
And once you had done that, yeah, you end up with these beautiful, short, poetic, gut-wrenching vignettes. Um, and the way that they're structured in the book, we see you living with your grief. And
Yeah.
then we also see these moments of you and Curtis together. It's punctuated with these moments of the two of you. How how did you decide how to order them?
So it's a good question. These are all beautiful questions. Thank you.
Mhm,
Um, so at first I had them sectioned, kind of grouped, if you will, by theme.
mhm,
And I knew that they wouldn't end up thematically grouped in the book, but it was too crazy to try to organize them when I was still writing. So I kind of would write by theme. So there would be like the chunk that was like Curtis in my life, and I would write all of that this way.
mhm,
And then there would be the chunk that was, people interacting with me and my grief. Then there was the medical chunk. So, like, my experience of that. And I kind
mhm,
of wrote all of those siloed. And once I was happy with the way those segments worked, I printed out everything that I had and I would lay them out on the floor. And then to repeat the hunchback, I would hunch over those and I would start swapping them in out. And I did this for hours, for months. It's so odd to be like, writing is actually really hard on your body, but leaning over pieces of paper and swapping them for hours on
mhm,
end is actually sort of taxing in its own way. And I would seek a kind of braiding, if you will. Okay, we're going to
mhm,
do this, but then this is going to come. And I would think about when I would put one section next to another, how do these sections talk to each other? What is the resonance that's created simply because these two things live in the same place? Meaning by proximity is something that's very interesting to me. If we just put
mhm,
A beside T, what
mhm,
do those two things mean? Well, they form the word at. This is a completely different thing.
mhm,
And so I was doing that with the vignettes. And I would just think about, okay, well, what does it mean if we swap this out? And I started to follow how they spoke to each other, what they meant. Some of that is instinctual, and some of that I would really think about juxtaposing. I think there's a moment in the book where I end on something very lyric, water, sound and water, and the next paragraph is Moma has diarrhea for 6 months. I deliberately chose to put something so lyric beside something so mundane because that is the experience of grief. You can have this beautiful moment, and the next moment you have to go deal with your dog
yeah,
who is sick.
yeah,
Um, and so braiding like that was how I did it. And then doing it again, and then again, and iterating like that until it reached a form. And then also when you do that, sometimes you think, oh, there's like holes here where I would like to put this type of vignette here, but I don't have one written. And so then I would have to think about writing that in. So it became this kind of instinctual braiding process that, or hope, comes across as something that's simple and easy and there's a flow to it in the book, but that
mhm.
is hard one. you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, there is a an easy there's a beautiful flow to the book, but it is you can tell in the reading that it was very intentional, and it feels like there's a lot of work and thought and layering, like, put
Yeah,
into
and I think that's what separates a project from a book. A project can happen as it happens, but a
Mhm.
book is made, it's created,
Mhm,
and there
mhm.
is an intention behind every book, really.
Yeah, I love the physicality of it too, though, of really just,
Yes.
like, holding these pieces and, like, putting them this beside this and seeing what that feels like.
Mhm.
How do they talk to each other?
Yeah.
You said that Curtis was the first person to call you a writer,
Yeah.
but you'd been writing for a
Mhm.
long time before he gave you that gift of calling you a writer. How did you start?
I think Curtis was the first person who didn't know me to call me a writer.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense? And I think there's
Yes.
something to be named something like that by someone who doesn't know you at all.
Mhm.
The first person to call me a writer is my mother.
Mm.
And she has maintained that her whole life. Actually, when this book sold, she gave me a card that she had written, I think when I was in my mid-20s, maybe, that said, "For when Amy sells a book." And she just knew, and has always been such a believer in the writing.
Mm.
I first started writing as a child. I would write diaries, and still have some of them where I spend pages laboriously describing myself to my future readers. I'm 5 foot tall. I have brown eyes. So in some ways, I think I imagined an audience for myself as a child. And then when I got a little bit older and I was away at university, it was just at the edge of blogging becoming, what would become this massive thing
Mhm.
in kind of like the 2010s, if you will.
Mhm.
And I would blog while I was at university, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed mining my life in some ways for things to send home to my family. But it wasn't until I was in school for education, because I'm also a teacher,
Mhm.
that my mom encouraged me to take some adult continuing education classes online in creative writing. And I think I took 2 classes. One of them you didn't do a lot of creative writing, but one of them you did. I wrote a short story, and that was the short story that I used to apply to graduate school when I graduated university for teaching.
Mhm.
And really, my entry, I firmly believe you don't need an MFA to write.
Mhm.
Just for me, I entered an MFA, and that was when I seriously started writing, and that would have been in 2015.
And what was that like? You went to Warren Wilson, right, for
I
your
did, yes.
MFA.
Incredible
Um,
program.
what was that like?
Very intense, because I started my journey at Warren Wilson while I was teaching in my first full-time job ever. And I had just started dating Curtis maybe like 5 or 6 months before. And I was also teaching as an adjunct at the university.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I worked something like 110 hours a week, something truly too much. I was working far too much, and Curtis was very accommodating of it. But entering grad school was one of the rare times in my life where I felt that I was myself. I think a lot of times in my life, I think a lot of writers, truthfully,
Mhm.
maybe come to writing because they have a difficulty translating their interior experience
Mhm.
outwardly. And writing
Mm.
becomes a way for them to kind of translate themselves to other people.
Mhm.
And I feel that acutely in a lot of spaces, that I have to kind of like learn what people are kind of doing out here. And then I try to translate myself to match that.
Mhm.
When I went to grad school, I felt no need to do that. And it was one of the first places, besides like my relationship with my mother or my relationship with Curtis, where I didn't feel the need to translate. And Warren Wilson, I was really lucky. They gave me a kind of creative home
Mhm.
and permission and acceptance that I really thrived in. And I received a lot of encouragement to continue to write in that program. And yeah, they started me on a path that I knew I knew that I wanted to be on it. I
Mhm.
was working a lot. If I didn't want to be in the program, I wouldn't have. But I had no idea that it would sustain me. I knew it was something I
Mm.
wanted to do, but I didn't know
Mhm.
that writing would sustain me. And I'm not speaking in a financial way, because it does not sustain me financially. But, when Curtis died, I had my family who loved me and my friends who loved me, and I had writing. And that was something where I thought, oh my gosh, that's what my mom has known this whole time. That's what Curtis knew when he met me. I just didn't know that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's really special.
On your author website, you do something that I think is really cool, which is ask a question or a series of
Mhm.
questions underneath each piece of your work
Yeah,
that you've listed. What was the purpose behind that? What made you decide to do that?
it's really a personal belief that I have about art, which is that all art should continue to ask questions until it arrives at the unanswerable question. And when I consider art, I really have a love of visual art as well as written art.
Mhm.
I will often ask myself, okay, what are the obvious questions that this piece asks? And then I'll continue to ask until I reach something, hopefully, something that isn't so easily answered, that maybe is unanswerable. And I
Mhm.
think that's art that pushes the questions far enough. And that's often the art that moves me the most because it's going into a place where there aren't easy answers and where it's kind of uncomfortable to live.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes where art breaks down is where it offers us thoughtful questions or palatable questions, but it doesn't push them hard enough. And so when I approach any written piece, I'm always tracking what are the questions that I'm asking. And am I asking the scary ones or the ones that I'm kind of afraid to put a voice to? And when people kind of skim over on my website the work, I want them to know, well, these are the questions that I'm asking, and those might be the ones you're asking. And so this might be a piece for you. It seems like the easiest way to introduce people to who I am.
Mhm.
I'm kind of a intense question asker in real life, not something I've realized until very recently.
Mhm.
But I tend to ask people just in the flow of things, odd questions, because I'm interested in their interior lives. And that can make some people love it and they feel really seen by it. And
Mhm.
I'm learning some people feel very uncomfortable. And I'm like, so, what does it feel like to be you today? And people are like, whoa, it's a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, but I really believe in the power of questions to connect us with people. And I think art has that power more than anything.
I love that. Do you think that art requires an audience?
Hmm. It's a great question. I think that it does not. I think anyone can make art. And
Mm.
I think what art's power is that it can nourish us and sustain us and ask questions of us that we need to move through our lives. But I don't think it needs an audience. I think a lot of times witness is necessary to continue, but I don't think art needs it. I
Mm.
think artists do need witness to continue to create at certain points because every artist reaches a point where they think, okay, well, why am I making these things? Art at its best connects us to ourselves in ways we didn't expect. And at its best takes that self connection and allows us to better connect with others. And that is, I think, what art does at its highest, in its highest form, is it connects us and we think, oh, someone else asked that unanswerable question. Me too. And two people who feel lost suddenly start talking to each other. And that does require audience. And that requires courage on the behalf of the artist.
Yeah. What is your writing routine like now? And what are you working on?
It's a great question. So when I'm teaching full time, which I'm not right now because I'm about to go on tour, but
Mm.
when I'm teaching full time, I write on the weekends and I'm quite structured about it. I will schedule the time in. I don't take lunch dates. If people are in town, I tell them I'm unavailable during certain times or else I just never get any writing done.
Mhm.
Because I'm on leave right now, I start writing Monday through Friday. And then I say I take the weekends off, but truthfully, I almost always will write a little bit on Saturday. And I really
Mm.
try to take one day off. But the routine is always the same. I like to get up. I would really rather not speak to people. If I have to, it's fine. It's not going to ruin my life. But I like to stay quiet inside kind of the thought sphere that I have.
Mhm.
I always put my hair up, not even ponytail, like fully tied up. I
Mhm.
I don't know if I've ever written anything with my hair down.
Wow.
I know it's a funny thing. I have to have my hair up, away from my face, and then I brew tea. I am a lifetime green tea drinker.
Mhm.
And once I have those two things, I like to start writing in the morning because by about 2 p.m. I start to lose my will to live, truthfully. And I usually have to take a break before I come back to it, if I come back to it at all. But it's always hair up, tea brewed, and then the hunchback.
Yeah. And can you just but from that morning time until about 2 in the afternoon, you're staying at
Yeah,
it?
I call it writing time because I think it's, I mean, maybe some people can do this. They sit down at 9 a.m. and they write till 2, just constantly going.
Mm,
I don't think that's true of a lot of people.
mm,
I think a lot of writing is sitting at your computer wishing you were doing something else. But for me, I have to ritualize the time.
mm,
So if I spend a day 9 till 2 where I sit at my computer, I write 3 paragraphs, and the rest of it, I'm really like scrolling my phone or answering some emails. Okay, not my best writing day, but I showed up. I put myself at risk of writing a paragraph
mhm,
and continue to do that. I think that being present where the writing happens will always outproduce waiting for the writing to happen to you.
mm,
Because I don't know, writing is at its best if you're doing work that you're really engaged with, pretty difficult, and going places that you're kind of scared of. And I think you meet resistance when you do work like that. And if you're not just there every day, I think it's hard for the work to show up. So you have to show up before the work does. So I do that, but I spend a lot of days kind of like twirling in my chair, but I never
mm.
leave the chair. I refill water, I go to the bathroom, I like go to the doorbell if I get a package. But otherwise, I'm in the chair.
That's great. I love that. What will you go back to fiction? Are you going back to fiction?
Yes, I'm working on a novel right now, actually. I started a new novel project last summer while I was kind of in limbo between the book being turned in
Mm,
and starting to really like get hands-on for the book coming out. And yeah, I really wanted to write a mystery novel because I grew up reading them and I love
mhm.
them. And so that's what I'm doing right now. It's really fun. It's
Oh,
humbling.
that's really
Mystery is very hard to write. I'm getting very humbled by it, but I'm having a lot of fun.
great. What do you want people to know about you?
Well, it's a great question. I think so much of who I am as a griever is in the book.
Mm,
But then I think outside of that, what I try to remind people of is that I am a very private person with a very public pain,
mm,
and that there's a tension in that, and that there is a lot of vulnerability for me to have the most tender part of my life very public,
mm,
but that it isn't, that's not my most comfortable mode. And sometimes I mean, I want all of us, I think, more so to step more tenderly towards each other. Everybody could benefit from just a little bit more softness. But I think sometimes people see the ways that the book is out in the world and think that this is my preferred mode of being.
yeah.
And that it's easy for me to show up in this way, but it's actually not. And it's scary. And when people hold me really tenderly or really gently, I really appreciate that because we can make, or I can make certainly, gods of people who are brave,
Mhm,
but they're just people, you know. And the only thing that made me brave and wish to release this book was that this book was about Curtis. There's a lot more of me in this book than I intended. And that was
mm,
at the urging of my agent and my editor, who said that people would want to know me. And I said, well, I don't,
mhm,
this isn't about me. This is about Curtis. And they said, but it's also about you. And
mhm,
I really had to dig deep to share about myself. And I was only able to do that when I considered how much Curtis loved me. And so any of the courage that people would attribute to this book is really Curtis's bravery because he was brave.
that's beautiful. I have a traditional final question in
Amazing.
this podcast, which centers around music.
Mhm.
And I normally ask authors if they can think of a kind of theme song for their work. Do you have a particular song or a piece of music that you think pairs with Hereafter?
I absolutely do. I need to look it up. Give me 1 second. Of course, I'm gonna forget what it is. It's shoot, what is it called? I may have to send it to you after.
That's fine.
I'm going to describe it though, because I can find the name, but it's a musical installation, and it's done with very large screens, but it is music. And you have, I think he was a member of the band Sigur Rós, but he brings together all of these different musicians in this huge manor. I think maybe somewhere in upstate New York. And it's something like a 12 of them maybe. And as you start listening to it, first you have the lead, and he's playing some sort of guitar or something in a bathtub. And that's one screen. And then somewhere else in the rest of the mansion, in a different room entirely, another woman starts playing an accordion, and then a man in a ballroom starts playing the piano. And all of these musicians start coming online, and they're all playing a massive choral piece, but they are separate from each other, connected only by their headphones in this manner. And it's a beautiful piece, because there's something about loss in the music. You can feel it tangibly. And when I looked it up later, grief does motivate the piece. You can feel it. And it's about an hour long. And I remember standing there, I saw it after Curtis died, and just like weeping, because the music ached in a way that I thought, oh my gosh, to have these people separated, united by this music, it's deeply moving. And it's just, yeah, I think I remember thinking, wow, this is grief. And I will send the title of it to you, but it's the soundtrack of the book, undoubtedly.
Oh, that's incredible. Okay, I'm looking forward to I can't wait to check it out, and I'll put the title in the show notes. Amy, thank you so much
Thank
for
you. This was such a beautiful conversation.
it was wonderful talking to you.
No, I'm so grateful. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.